The most dangerous people in aviation are not the pilots breaking rules. They are the executives convinced money makes rules optional. Freezing wind tore across the Manhattan rooftop helipad while snow clouds rolled slowly over the Hudson River, beneath dark January skies glowing silver above Midtown towers, and blinking aviation lights stretching endlessly across the city below. Rotor blades thundered violently against the winter air as a black executive helicopter settled onto the rooftop landing pad surrounded by floodlights, fuel equipment, and bundled ground crews wearing reflective jackets beneath the freezing conditions. Around the perimeter, aviation technicians secured safety zones while radio chatter crackled sharply through headsets carrying weather updates from incoming storm systems drifting across New York airspace. I stood near the fuel station reviewing updated weather advisories on a digital compliance tablet, while icy wind whipped against my heavy coat and aviation headset beneath the rooftop floodlights reflecting across wet steel surfaces surrounding the landing area. At 61 years old, I had spent nearly 3 decades managing executive rotor operations across Manhattan rooftops, corporate air corridors, and restricted urban landing systems where one careless decision could kill people within seconds. Pilots understood that. Mechanics understood that. Ground crews definitely understood that. Billionaire executives, however, often believed helicopters operated according to ego instead of physics. Garrett Sloan stepped out of the aircraft wearing an expensive charcoal coat, while snow flurries drifted sideways beneath the spinning rotor wash surrounding the landing pad. 2 younger executives followed him carrying leather portfolios and phones glowing brightly against the freezing rooftop darkness. Garrett barely looked at the ground crew securing the aircraft beside him. Men like him rarely notice the people keeping them alive operationally. "We leave again in 20 minutes. He shouted sharply over the rotor noise while walking toward the heated executive elevator enclosure near the rooftop access doors. One pilot immediately removed his headset while glancing toward the worsening cloud conditions above the Hudson corridor beyond the skyline. "Weather advisories are escalating fast," he warned carefully. "Visibility across the river may fall below safe operational minimums before departure clearance." Garrett stopped walking slowly before turning around beneath the floodlights reflecting against the icy rooftop surface. Irritation crossed his face instantly. "Then refuel faster," he snapped. "I have investors waiting in Connecticut." Around the landing pad, several younger ground technicians lowered their eyes immediately while freezing wind carried snow across the rooftop beneath the flashing aviation lights surrounding the tower. Garrett pointed directly toward me beside the fuel station. "You," he barked loudly. "Refuel my chopper tech. We are not sitting here because of weather drama." Funny thing about powerful men. They often mistake calmness for submission because nobody important ever taught them the difference between operational authority and customer service. I remained standing quietly beneath the rooftop floodlights while snow gathered across the steel railing overlooking Manhattan far below. "Departure clearance remains under weather review," I answered calmly through the headset microphone. Garrett laughed sharply beneath the freezing wind while one younger executive shifted awkwardly beside him. "Do you know who I am?" That question always reveals the same thing about executives eventually. Deep insecurity hidden beneath expensive confidence. One pilot looked visibly uncomfortable now because, unlike Garrett, aviation crews understood exactly who managed rooftop compliance authority across Manhattan corporate rotor operations. Garrett stepped closer across the icy rooftop surface while rotor blades continued spinning heavily behind him beneath the storm-dark skyline. "I do not care what checklist you people hide behind," he snapped coldly. "Fuel the helicopter and clear the departure route." Around us, snow intensified suddenly while warning lights flashed red along the rooftop perimeter, and radio chatter crackled urgently through multiple aviation channels reporting deteriorating visibility conditions across the Hudson River corridor. I reviewed the updated weather compliance system calmly beneath the floodlights reflecting against the frozen landing pad, while Garrett continued glaring impatiently toward the crew around him. Then a sharp notification appeared across the operations tablet in my hand. "Flight risk advisory escalation. Automatic compliance review triggered." I looked up slowly toward Garrett beneath the freezing Manhattan wind, while the helicopter engines idled heavily behind him against the skyline. "Mr. Sloan," I said quietly, "your aircraft just entered formal operational review status." For the first time since stepping onto the rooftop, the billionaire chief executive officer stopped talking. Snow hammered sideways across the Manhattan rooftop while warning lights blinked red through freezing wind surrounding the executive helipad high above Lexington Avenue and the dark Hudson River corridor beyond the skyline below. The helicopter engines continued idling heavily against the storm conditions while ground crews secured equipment beside the landing pad beneath floodlights reflecting sharply across ice-covered steel surfaces and wet aviation markings glowing against the rooftop. Garrett Sloan stared at me beside the fueling station as if he genuinely could not process hearing the word no from someone wearing an operations headset instead of an executive title. Around him, younger executives shifted nervously while pilots exchanged quiet looks beneath the worsening weather conditions rolling over Manhattan airspace. Operational review? Garrett repeated sharply. Over weather? I remained calm while reviewing the updated compliance tablet in my gloved hands beneath the freezing wind tearing across the rooftop. Not only weather, I answered quietly. The review system flagged multiple unresolved operational irregularities connected to previous flight requests. One pilot removed his headset slowly before stepping closer beside the aircraft beneath the spinning rotor blades and flashing rooftop lights. Captain Daniel Reeves had flown executive rotor operations across New York for nearly 18 years. Like most experienced pilots, he respected procedure because, unlike executives, pilots understood physics does not negotiate emotionally. Mr. Sloan, Daniel said carefully, the compliance review needs immediate resolution before departure authorization can continue safely. Garrett laughed bitterly while snow collected across his expensive wool coat beneath the rooftop floodlights. This is unbelievable. I own half the energy infrastructure on the East Coast, and now I am trapped on a roof because someone with a fuel tablet thinks they control airspace. Funny thing about aviation authority. The people who actually control safety almost never look powerful publicly. They look like mechanics, dispatch coordinators, compliance officers, and weather analysts standing quietly near helicopters while billionaires assume they are invisible support staff. Around the rooftop perimeter, wind speeds increased sharply while aviation radios crackled constantly with revised weather advisories from incoming storm fronts approaching the Hudson corridor. One younger technician hurried toward me carrying updated atmospheric readings beneath his reflective winter jacket. Crosswinds just exceeded rooftop operational tolerance thresholds, he reported through the headset. I nodded once before forwarding the updated measurements directly into the operations review system, connected to the Regional Aviation Compliance Network, overseeing Manhattan executive rotor traffic. Garrett watched silently now while the realization slowly began settling across his face. This was not customer service. This was infrastructure. You really think you can ground my aircraft? He asked coldly. Before I answered, Captain Reeves spoke first beneath the heavy rotor noise surrounding the rooftop. Sir, she is not grounding the aircraft personally. The compliance system is. Garrett turned sharply toward the pilot. Then override it. Silence spread briefly across the landing pad beneath the storm-dark skyline, and spinning helicopter blades echoing through the freezing Manhattan night. Pilots hate hearing executives say things like that because every fatal aviation disaster begins with someone important. Believing procedure should bend around urgency, money, or ego. Captain Reeves looked exhausted suddenly. That is not how aviation works, he answered quietly. Garrett stepped closer toward me across the icy rooftop while snow whipped violently through the floodlights surrounding the landing zone. Who exactly are you? He demanded. I looked toward the skyline beyond the rooftop where warning beacons flashed red through drifting storm clouds above the river. Evelyn Mercer, I replied calmly. Senior Rotor Operations Compliance Director for Northeast Executive Aviation Governance. One younger executive beside Garrett suddenly went pale beneath the floodlights. Apparently someone near him finally recognized the title. Garrett, however, still looked irritated instead of concerned, because men like him often assume technical authority matters less than executive status until systems begin collapsing around them personally. I reviewed the compliance alerts once more while radio chatter intensified across multiple channels reporting deteriorating visibility conditions throughout Manhattan airspace. Then another notification appeared across the tablet screen beneath the freezing rooftop lights. Additional operational discrepancies identified. Automatic federal escalation recommended. Slowly, I looked back toward Garrett while snow drifted across the spinning helicopter behind him. Mr. Sloan, I said quietly, your aircraft now qualifies for formal federal review consideration. This time, even the pilots stopped moving. The storm intensified after midnight while freezing rain and heavy snow slammed against midtown skyscrapers, beneath dark aviation corridors stretching over the Hudson River and lower Manhattan beyond the glowing skyline below. Across the rooftop helipad, floodlights cut sharply through swirling weather while the grounded executive helicopter remained secured against violent crosswinds beneath flashing perimeter beacons and drifting sheets of ice-covered snow racing across the steel landing surface. Most corporate executives had already retreated downstairs hours earlier into heated boardrooms and luxury offices far removed from the operational chaos surrounding real aviation decisions. Ground crews, however, remained on the roof because weather does not care about executive schedules. Around 1:30 in the morning, I stood inside the rooftop operations enclosure reviewing federal escalation notices beneath fluorescent lighting humming softly above weather monitors, fuel system dashboards, and aviation compliance terminals connected directly into the Northeast Rotor Traffic Network overseeing executive helicopter operations across New York airspace. Outside the reinforced windows, snow whipped violently around the aircraft while maintenance crews checked rotor restraints beneath floodlights reflecting silver against the frozen landing pad. Captain Daniel Reeves entered quietly carrying updated incident summaries beneath one arm, while removing snow-covered gloves beside the operations desk. 3 prior weather override requests tied to Sloan Aviation Holdings, he reported carefully. 2 involved pressure to depart during restricted visibility advisories. I reviewed the reports silently while storm warnings flashed red across multiple aviation monitors, lining the operations wall beneath the cold fluorescent lighting. None of this surprised me. Executives addicted to speed eventually begin treating safety systems like inconveniences instead of survival mechanisms. That mentality spreads quietly through flight departments until someone finally stops it. Daniel leaned against the operations counter, while watching snowfall hammer against the rooftop outside. The younger pilots are nervous, he admitted softly. Garrett keeps implying operational delays hurt investor confidence. I looked toward the storm-dark skyline beyond the reinforced glass while helicopters across Manhattan remained grounded beneath regional weather restrictions. Investor confidence matters less than funeral reports, I answered calmly. Pilots understand sentences like that because unlike executives, pilots measure mistakes in body counts instead of quarterly losses. Around 3 o'clock, Garrett Sloan arrived upstairs again wearing a dark cashmere coat over wrinkled executive clothes while 2 aviation attorneys followed him through the secured rooftop corridor beneath emergency lighting reflecting across wet concrete floors leading toward the operations center. Even exhausted from the long night, Garrett still carried himself with the irritated confidence of a man accustomed to systems bending around his frustration eventually. He entered the operations room without greeting anyone. I just spent 2 hours speaking with Private Aviation Counsel, he announced sharply beneath the fluorescent lighting. This review is excessive and economically damaging. One younger compliance analyst near the weather consoles lowered his eyes immediately, while continuing radar updates across the regional airspace system. Garrett noticed the reaction instantly because powerful men survive through intimidation long before competence stops working for them. Release the helicopter, he demanded coldly while placing legal documents across the operations desk in front of me. The storm is easing. I reviewed the updated weather feeds silently while freezing rain continued smashing against the rooftop windows overlooking Midtown below. Visibility remained unstable. Wind shear conditions across the Hudson corridor still fluctuated dangerously between acceptable and restricted operational thresholds. More importantly, the federal review system had now expanded beyond weather. Garrett still did not fully understand that part yet. The aircraft remains under operational investigation, I answered calmly. Garrett leaned closer across the desk beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. You are a compliance director, not Federal Aviation Authority. Funny thing about operational governance. The people dismissing it publicly usually understand at least privately. Before I could answer, one of the aviation attorneys beside Garrett adjusted several files nervously beneath the overhead lighting. Actually, the attorney interrupted carefully. Her office directly interfaces with regional compliance escalation systems tied to federal rotor governance oversight. Silence settled instantly across the operations center, while storm warnings blinked red across the weather monitors surrounding us. Garrett slowly turned toward the attorney beside him as realization finally began cutting through his anger. Outside beyond the reinforced windows, snow continued falling heavily across Manhattan, while grounded helicopters remained motionless beneath the floodlit skyline. Then another compliance alert appeared across the main operations monitor. Federal preliminary audit authorized. Temporary executive rotor restrictions recommended pending investigation review. This time Garrett did not speak immediately. He simply stared at the screen while the storm raged outside above the sleeping city below. Morning arrived slowly over Manhattan beneath pale gray skies while fresh snow covered rooftop structures, frozen landing pads, and silent helicopter corridors stretching above the Hudson River and Midtown towers glowing softly beneath early winter light. The storm had finally weakened overnight, but the executive helicopter remained grounded on the rooftop helipad under temporary operational restriction status, while federal review systems continued processing compliance alerts connected to Garrett Sloan's aviation activity. Across the city below, commuters filled icy sidewalks and steaming subway entrances, completely unaware that one of the most powerful executives in New York had just lost control of the aircraft he treated like a private limousine in the sky. Around 7:30 that morning, rooftop crews resumed limited operational procedures beneath freezing wind and flashing aviation beacons surrounding the helipad high above Lexington Avenue. Mechanics inspected rotor systems while fuel technicians reviewed overnight weather exposure reports beside the grounded aircraft beneath floodlights, still glowing against the icy steel landing surface. I stood near the operations enclosure reviewing updated federal communications through the rooftop compliance network, while hot coffee steamed beside weather consoles and airspace monitors humming softly beneath fluorescent lighting. Captain Daniel Reeves entered carrying revised inspection records beneath one arm before lowering his voice carefully. The board from Sloan Energy just contacted aviation legal operations, he explained quietly. Apparently, Garrett missed a major investor summit in Connecticut overnight. I nodded once while scanning updated clearance restrictions connected to the helicopter registration file. Weather delays happen, I answered calmly. Daniel looked toward the grounded aircraft outside the reinforced windows where mechanics moved carefully across the frozen rooftop beneath pale morning light. This is bigger than weather now, he admitted. Yes, it was. Because once federal aviation systems begin reviewing operational culture, investigators stop focusing only on storms. They start examining patterns, pressure, behavior, risk tolerance. And Garrett Sloan had spent years teaching aviation crews exactly how little patience he had for safety delays interfering with executive convenience. Around 9 o'clock, black luxury vehicles arrived downstairs while several corporate attorneys and board representatives entered the secured rooftop access corridor beneath emergency lighting reflecting against wet concrete walls leading toward the operations center. Word had clearly spread overnight through executive circles across Manhattan. Powerful people become deeply uncomfortable once aviation liability enters conversations involving investors, insurers, and federal oversight simultaneously. Garrett arrived minutes later wearing the same dark coat from the previous night while exhaustion and frustration settled visibly across his face beneath the cold fluorescent lighting inside the operations enclosure. He looked less like a billionaire chief executive officer now and more like a man realizing systems he ignored for years were finally evaluating him personally instead of protecting him automatically. I need that aircraft released immediately, he announced sharply while several attorneys gathered behind him reviewing tablets and compliance summaries beneath the humming overhead lights. Markets open in less than 30 minutes. One federal liaison connected remotely through the compliance network appeared across the operations monitor beside updated rotor safety records and regional airspace restrictions. The woman on screen spoke calmly without emotion. Mr. Sloan, your executive aviation division currently remains under preliminary operational audit review pending investigation into repeated weather override pressure incidents. Silence settled heavily through the room afterward while snow drifted softly outside across the silent rooftop helipad beyond the reinforced windows. Garrett looked stunned for the first time since this situation began. Pressure incidents? He repeated slowly. The federal liaison continued reviewing the file without reacting emotionally. Multiple pilots and operational personnel documented concerns regarding repeated attempts to expedite departures during restricted visibility advisories and unstable weather conditions. Around the operations center, younger compliance analysts remained completely silent, while Garrett's attorneys exchanged deeply uncomfortable looks beneath the fluorescent lighting. One finally stepped closer toward him and lowered his voice carefully. "Garrett, if insurer audits become involved, this could affect executive flight coverage nationally." That sentence changed everything. Billionaires tolerate inconvenience. Boards tolerate delays. Insurers, however, terrify executives because insurance systems measure risk mathematically instead of socially. Garrett slowly turned toward me across the operations center, while winter sunlight reflected faintly against snow-covered rooftop structures beyond the windows. "You started this," he said coldly. I looked toward the grounded helicopter sitting motionless beneath the pale Manhattan skyline before answering quietly. "No, Mr. Sloan. Your own operational behavior started this years ago. The system simply finally noticed." Outside beyond the reinforced glass, helicopters from other corporations began crossing carefully above the Hudson corridor again beneath the clearing winter sky, while Garrett Sloan's aircraft remained completely still on the frozen rooftop behind us. By Thursday afternoon, the storm system had finally cleared beyond the Hudson corridor, while sharp winter sunlight reflected across Manhattan skyscrapers and frozen rooftop structures stretching above the East River beneath pale blue January skies. Helicopters once again crossed carefully through regulated airspace over Midtown and Lower Manhattan, their rotor noise echoing between glass towers and snow-covered rooftops throughout the city below. Garrett Sloan's aircraft, however, remained motionless on the Lexington rooftop helipad beneath ongoing operational restriction status, while federal aviation auditors continued reviewing years of executive flight conduct tied to Sloan Energy's private rotor division. Around the aviation industry, rumors had already begun spreading quietly through pilot lounges, insurer networks, compliance offices, and executive transport contractors. Nothing travels faster in aviation than stories involving wealthy executives who mistake procedure for inconvenience. Inside the rooftop operations center, fluorescent lighting hummed softly above compliance monitors and regional airspace systems, while younger analysts processed updated federal audit requests connected to Sloan Aviation Holdings. I reviewed insurer communications beside weather consoles overlooking the helipad through reinforced windows where mechanics performed routine maintenance checks around the grounded helicopter beneath bright winter sunlight reflecting across frozen steel surfaces. Captain Daniel Reeves entered carrying revised insurer advisories beneath one arm before closing the operations room door quietly behind him. "This is becoming much larger than Garrett expected," he admitted while placing the documents across the operations desk. I scanned the reports silently while helicopters drifted across the skyline outside beyond the rooftop perimeter. Several executive aviation insurers had initiated independent risk reassessments connected to Sloan Energy flight operations. Additional corporate boards were now requesting safety culture reviews from their own transport divisions, after learning how aggressively Garrett pressured crews during restricted weather conditions. Aviation works that way. Once operational behavior becomes publicly questionable, trust deteriorates rapidly because nobody wants executive arrogance associated with aircraft carrying investors, board members, or corporate leadership through unstable weather systems above crowded cities. Around 3 o'clock, Garrett arrived upstairs again, accompanied this time by 2 board directors instead of attorneys. That detail mattered immediately. Lawyers defend executives. Boards protect corporations from executives. Garrett looked exhausted beneath the fluorescent operations lighting while snow melted slowly from his dark overcoat, after walking across the rooftop access corridor from the executive elevators below. The board directors, however, appeared far more concerned than angry. One older director stepped toward the operations desk carefully before speaking in a calm, measured tone. "Ms. Mercer, we would like clarification regarding the current review timeline and operational exposure affecting Sloan Energy aviation assets." Respectful language suddenly appeared now that insurers and federal auditors entered the conversation. Funny how quickly invisible workers become important once wealthy institutions realize those workers actually control risk systems protecting billions of dollars. I reviewed the updated federal audit schedule quietly before answering. The review currently focuses on repeated operational pressure patterns involving weather override expectations, accelerated departure requests, and compliance hostility toward aviation crews. Garrett immediately interrupted. "This is ridiculous." I pushed for efficiency. Captain Reeves looked toward him carefully beneath the humming fluorescent lights. "Sir, Pilots documented concerns because several flights occurred near restricted operational tolerance levels. Silence settled heavily afterward while the board directors exchanged uncomfortable glances near the operations consoles. One younger compliance analyst continued monitoring regional helicopter traffic, quietly beside radar systems displaying stable Manhattan airspace conditions across glowing digital maps. Finally, one board director exhaled slowly before looking directly at Garrett. "Did you repeatedly pressure crews during weather advisories?" Garrett hesitated for the first time since this situation began. That hesitation answered the question better than words could. Outside the reinforced windows, another executive helicopter lifted smoothly above Midtown before banking west across the Hudson beneath bright winter sunlight. Garrett watched the aircraft silently while his own helicopter remained grounded behind him on the frozen rooftop. In that moment, he finally looked less like a billionaire chief executive officer, and more like a man realizing movement itself now depended on people he spent years treating like replaceable service staff. I closed the compliance folder calmly beneath the fluorescent lighting, while rotor noise echoed faintly across Manhattan outside. "Power does not fly without permission," I said quietly. Neither board director disagreed. Friday evening settled cold and clear across Manhattan, while helicopters crossed the Hudson corridor beneath glowing winter skies and silver reflections shimmered against skyscraper windows stretching above Midtown avenues packed with headlights and frozen sidewalks below. On the Lexington rooftop helipad, however, tension continued building quietly beneath floodlights and rotating aviation beacons reflecting across snow-covered steel surfaces surrounding Garrett Sloan's grounded aircraft. What began as one executive shouting at a compliance director had now evolved into something far larger and far more dangerous for Sloan Energy itself. Aviation insurers were reviewing operational culture. Federal auditors were examining pilot testimony. Board members were questioning executive judgment privately. And for the first time in years, Garrett Sloan could no longer move through the sky simply because he expected systems to obey him automatically. Inside the rooftop operations center, fluorescent lights reflected softly across radar displays, compliance terminals, and regional weather systems tracking stable evening airspace above New York City. Younger analysts monitored rotor traffic while maintenance crews finalized overnight inspection schedules around the grounded helicopter, outside beneath freezing wind, drifting across the rooftop. I reviewed updated insurer findings beside the operations desk, while hot coffee cooled slowly beside stacks of federal audit summaries connected to Sloan Aviation Holdings. Captain Daniel Reeves stood nearby watching helicopters cross the skyline through reinforced windows overlooking the city below. "More pilots submitted statements this afternoon," he said quietly. "Not only from Sloan Energy." That did not surprise me either. Once operational intimidation becomes visible publicly, people throughout aviation begin speaking more honestly, because they realize they were never isolated individually. They were surviving the same culture together silently. Around 7:30, Garrett entered the operations center alone for the first time since the investigation began. No eternis. No board directors. No executive entourage. Just a tired billionaire wearing a dark winter coat beneath fluorescent lighting, while rotor noise echoed faintly across the rooftop outside. He looked older now. Not physically. Emotionally. Like a man beginning to understand his authority had always depended upon invisible professionals cooperating quietly around him every single day. Garrett stopped beside the operations desk while analysts continued working silently nearby, pretending not to notice him. "Do you know what this has cost me already?" he asked coldly without looking directly at me. I continued reviewing compliance summaries calmly before answering. Operational recklessness usually becomes expensive eventually. He laughed bitterly beneath the fluorescent lights. "You think this is about safety?" Finally, I looked toward him across the operations center, while Manhattan glowed behind us beyond the reinforced rooftop windows. "No," Ian suarat sufli. "I think this is about a man who spent years believing everyone responsible for keeping him alive existed beneath him socially." Silence followed immediately afterward while helicopters crossed the skyline beyond the operations room, overlooking the East River and Midtown towers glowing against the winter darkness outside. Garrett stared through the windows toward the aircraft still grounded on the rooftop landing pad beneath rotating floodlights and drifting snow. "I built a multi-billion-dollar company," he muttered quietly. And yet somehow a compliance officer controls whether I leave this roof. Funny thing about aviation. Wealth matters very little once rotor blades start turning above crowded cities. Gravity does not care about stock prices. Wind shear does not negotiate with ego. And rooftop helicopters crossing Manhattan require hundreds of invisible professionals following procedure correctly every single day or people die publicly. No, I corrected calmly beneath the humming fluorescent lights. Procedure controls whether you leave the roof. I simply enforce it. Garrett remained silent for several long seconds afterward, while younger analysts continued monitoring rotor traffic quietly around us. Then one of the regional compliance monitors flashed amber suddenly beside the weather systems displaying Manhattan airspace activity across the glowing digital screens. Captain Reeves stepped toward the console immediately while reviewing the incoming alert beneath the operations lighting. His expression changed instantly. Federal investigators just escalated the review, he announced carefully. They found archived communications documenting direct executive pressure on pilots during restricted weather operations. The operations center went completely silent. Garrett slowly closed his eyes beneath the fluorescent lighting, while helicopters continued crossing safely through the Manhattan skyline outside beyond the reinforced windows. Somewhere deep beneath the executive arrogance and billion-dollar confidence, reality had finally landed harder than any helicopter ever could. Saturday morning arrived beneath clear blue winter skies while Manhattan glittered under fresh snow and pale sunlight reflected across skyscraper windows stretching above the Hudson River and crowded avenues far below the rooftop aviation corridors crossing Midtown. Helicopters moved steadily through regulated airspace again, their distant rotor noise echoing between towers while executive travelers resumed carefully scheduled routes across New York City after days of severe storm disruptions. On the Lexington rooftop helipad, however, Garrett Sloan's aircraft remained grounded beneath active federal review, while mechanics continued routine preservation checks around the silent helicopter parked beneath rotating safety beacons and drifting ribbons of snow blowing across the steel landing surface. Around the aviation industry, the investigation had become impossible to ignore now. Pilots talked quietly inside airport lounges. Compliance officers exchanged messages across regional oversight networks. Insurance analysts reviewed executive risk exposure reports tied to Sloan Energy flight operations. Most importantly, aviation crews finally started speaking openly about things they tolerated silently for years. Inside the rooftop operations center, fluorescent lighting glowed softly above radar systems, weather consoles, and federal compliance monitors displaying Manhattan airspace activity across digital maps surrounding the room. Younger analysts worked calmly while radio chatter drifted through communication channels connected to regional rotor operations throughout the Northeast Corridor. I reviewed newly submitted testimony summaries beside the operations desk while Captain Daniel Reeves coordinated revised traffic schedules near the window overlooking the rooftop landing pad and skyline beyond. Another maintenance supervisor filed a statement this morning, Daniel said quietly while handing me a tablet beneath the fluorescent lighting. I scanned the report silently. The supervisor documented repeated incidents where Garrett demanded accelerated fueling procedures during unstable weather windows to avoid delaying executive meetings. None of the crews accused him of direct safety violations intentionally. That was the disturbing part. Garrett simply normalized operational pressure so consistently that younger technicians stopped recognizing how dangerous the culture had become over time. Around noon, several federal aviation investigators arrived through the secured rooftop corridor wearing dark winter coats beneath identification badges clipped neatly against heavy folders and inspection tablets. They moved professionally through the operations center without drama, because real institutional investigations rarely resemble television scandals. Most happen quietly through documentation, interviews, timelines, and patterns. One investigator reviewed archived communication logs while another examined departure authorization records connected to weather advisories spanning nearly 4 years of Sloan Energy rotor operations across Manhattan airspace. Garrett arrived shortly afterward accompanied by one exhausted board representative beneath the cold fluorescent lighting reflecting across the operations consoles and reinforced windows surrounding the rooftop center. He looked noticeably different now. Less aggressive. Less certain. Like someone realizing public authority disappears quickly once institutional systems stop protecting executive behavior automatically. The lead federal investigator finally closed one review folder before speaking calmly across the operations room. We identified multiple examples of operational personnel expressing concerns regarding pressure tied to executive scheduling priorities during unstable flight conditions. Garrett immediately looked toward the board representative beside him. This is being exaggerated. The investigator remained completely emotionless. Several pilots independently described similar patterns across separate years and weather events. Silence settled heavily through the operations center afterward, while rotor traffic moved steadily across the skyline outside beyond the reinforced windows overlooking Manhattan below. Then something unexpected happened. One younger fuel technician stepped forward quietly from near the equipment consoles where he had spent most of the morning reviewing maintenance logs beneath the fluorescent lighting. He looked nervous but determined. "Sir," he said carefully toward the investigators. "Most of us stayed quiet because nobody wanted to lose rooftop clearance assignments." Garrett stared at him in disbelief while snow drifted lightly across the rooftop outside beyond the operations room glass. The young technician swallowed hard before continuing. Ms. Mercer was the only person who ever stopped executives from pushing crews too far. Around the room, several mechanics and analysts exchanged silent looks because once one worker speaks honestly inside institutional cultures built on fear, others suddenly realize they were never alone. Another pilot nodded quietly near the weather consoles. Then a maintenance coordinator added her own concerns regarding scheduling pressure during restricted visibility operations over the Hudson corridor. Garrett looked around the operations center slowly, while the walls of silence protecting him for years finally collapsed one voice at a time beneath fluorescent lighting and federal oversight. Funny thing about ground crews, they remember everything executives say during storms. Monday morning arrived bright and brutally cold across Manhattan, while sunlight reflected sharply against snow-covered skyscrapers and helicopters crossed the Hudson corridor beneath crisp blue winter skies stretching over Midtown and the East River beyond the skyline. The city had returned to its normal rhythm after the storms, but inside executive aviation circles throughout New York, nothing about Sloan Energy remained normal anymore. Federal review teams continued processing testimony from pilots, mechanics, dispatch coordinators, and rooftop technicians while aviation insurers quietly reassessed every operational risk connected to Garrett Sloan's transport division. What once looked like one executive demanding faster helicopter departures had evolved into a full examination of institutional culture across an entire aviation network. On the Lexington rooftop helipad, the atmosphere felt completely different now beneath rotating safety beacons and clear winter light, reflecting across frozen steel landing surfaces overlooking Manhattan below. Ground crews moved calmly between fuel stations, maintenance carts, and weather consoles while pilots reviewed departure routes beside aircraft warming safely for morning flights across the Northeast corridor. No one rushed anymore. No one shouted. The rooftop finally operated the way professional aviation environments are supposed to function when fear no longer controls decision-making. Inside the rooftop operations center, fluorescent lighting glowed softly above radar systems and federal compliance terminals, while younger analysts coordinated stable rotor traffic patterns across Manhattan airspace. I reviewed revised oversight recommendations beside the operations desk while Captain Daniel Reeves finalized updated weather briefings near the reinforced windows overlooking the skyline beyond. Federal investigators completed preliminary findings this morning, Daniel said quietly while handing me a sealed compliance summary. I opened the report carefully beneath the humming operations lights while helicopters crossed above the Hudson outside. Repeated operational pressure confirmed. Executive interference concerns validated. Mandatory leadership restructuring recommended for Sloan Energy aviation oversight. None of it surprised me. Systems built around intimidation eventually collapse under scrutiny, because fear creates silence, not safety. Around 11 o'clock, Garrett Sloan returned to the rooftop for what everyone understood would likely be the final time during active operational control review. He arrived without security teams, attorneys, or board representatives beneath pale winter sunlight reflecting across the rooftop corridor leading toward the operations center. The difference in him now felt impossible to ignore. The arrogance remained somewhere underneath, but exhaustion had buried most of it beneath weeks of investigations, insurer pressure, federal audits, and internal board distancing. He stepped inside the operations room while younger analysts continued working quietly around the glowing compliance monitors and radar systems, displaying Manhattan helicopter traffic across digital maps. Nobody stopped working when he entered anymore. That probably disturbed him more than the investigation itself. Garrett looked through the reinforced windows toward the grounded helicopter resting beneath rooftop floodlights and drifting snow beside the skyline. The board suspended all executive rotor privileges this morning, he said quietly without looking at me directly. Captain Reeves remained silent near the weather consoles while radio chatter drifted softly through the operations center from helicopters crossing above the city outside. The aircraft will remain grounded pending complete restructuring review, I answered calmly. Garrett laughed once beneath the fluorescent lighting, but there was no anger left in it now. Only disbelief. I spent years believing the helicopter represented freedom, he admitted while staring toward the skyline beyond the rooftop. Funny thing about executives addicted to speed. They rarely realize the people slowing them down are usually the only reason they survive the trip. Outside the windows, another corporate helicopter lifted smoothly into the clear Manhattan sky before turning west across the Hudson beneath the bright winter sunlight. Garrett watched it silently for several long seconds. Then he finally looked toward me directly for the first time without arrogance protecting him emotionally. You really would have stopped me from flying that night, he said quietly. I met his eyes calmly across the operations center beneath the fluorescent lights humming softly above the compliance systems surrounding us. No, y correctamente. I would have stopped you from dying because you believed money mattered more than weather. Silence settled heavily afterward while rotor noise echoed faintly above the skyline outside. Garrett looked back toward the grounded helicopter one final time before turning slowly toward the exit corridor leading away from the rooftop operations center. As he disappeared beneath the cold winter sunlight reflecting across the frozen landing pad, one younger technician near the fuel consoles exhaled softly beside me. Then another mechanic smiled faintly while reviewing morning inspection logs beneath the glowing operations lights. Above Manhattan, helicopters continued crossing safely through the winter sky because somewhere on every rooftop, invisible people still refused to compromise procedure for powerful men in expensive coats. 3 weeks later, February sunlight rose slowly over Manhattan, while winter haze drifted above the Hudson River and helicopters crossed the skyline beneath pale morning skies glowing silver against glass towers stretching across Midtown and lower Manhattan below. From the rooftop operations center high above Lexington Avenue, the city looked calm again. Stable. Ordered. Helicopters moved carefully through regulated corridors while pilots followed approved departure paths above crowded streets where millions of people trusted invisible professionals they would never meet personally. That trust mattered more than executives ever understood. On the Lexington helipad, crews prepared morning aircraft beneath rotating safety beacons and freezing rooftop wind, while mechanics completed inspection routines around executive helicopters warming quietly against the skyline. Fuel technicians reviewed weather data beside service carts while younger pilots studied route briefings beneath floodlights fading slowly beneath the sunrise. Everything operated smoothly now because fear no longer controlled the rooftop. Procedure did. Inside the operations center, warm fluorescent lighting reflected softly across radar displays and federal compliance terminals, while regional rotor traffic moved steadily across digital maps covering the walls. Captain Daniel Reeves stood near the reinforced windows overlooking Manhattan, while reviewing departure schedules for the morning executive flights crossing toward Connecticut, Boston, and Washington beneath stable winter conditions. Federal review officially closed last night, he said quietly while handing me the final oversight summary. I opened the report slowly beneath the humming operations lights while helicopters drifted across the skyline beyond the windows. Sloan Energy executive rotor privileges permanently restructured. Mandatory compliance supervision implemented. Leadership authority removed from Garrett Sloan indefinitely. No dramatic language. No emotional punishment. Just institutional correction restoring operational balance after years of dangerous executive pressure, hidden beneath wealth and urgency. Funny thing about aviation. The system does not care how powerful someone becomes financially. It only cares whether the aircraft lands safely. Around 8:30, a young technician named Rachel entered the operations center carrying updated fuel manifests beneath one arm, while snow drifted lightly across the rooftop outside. She had only worked Manhattan rotor operations for 8 months, but already moved through the rooftop with more confidence than she did before the investigation began. "The morning crews feel different now," she admitted quietly while organizing paperwork beside the weather consoles. "Nobody is scared all the time anymore." I looked toward the skyline where helicopters crossed above the East River, beneath the pale winter sunrise spreading gold across Manhattan skyscrapers. "Good aviation crews should respect weather," I answered softly. "Not executives." Rachel smiled faintly afterward before returning toward the operations corridor leading back onto the rooftop. Younger workers always notice cultural changes first, because they feel unsafe environments more deeply than experienced crews who learned how to survive them silently over decades. Around noon, sunlight reflected brilliantly against snow-covered rooftops throughout Manhattan, while helicopters continued crossing safely through the winter sky above the city below. I stepped onto the helipad alone beneath freezing wind and blinking aviation lights surrounding the rooftop perimeter high above Lexington Avenue. The grounded Sloan helicopter was gone now, removed quietly overnight after federal review procedures finalized completely. In its place remained only an empty landing pad covered in drifting snow and pale sunlight stretching toward the skyline beyond the Hudson River. Funny how quickly symbols of power disappear once systems stop protecting the people using them recklessly. I walked slowly across the rooftop beneath the winter wind while rotor noise echoed distantly across Manhattan from helicopters moving safely through approved airspace corridors overhead. Nearly 30 years in executive aviation had taught me something wealthy men almost never understand. The people protecting your life usually stand closest to danger while receiving the least respect publicly. Pilots, mechanics, fuel crews, dispatch coordinators, compliance officers. Invisible professionals standing on frozen rooftops during storms, making certain executives reach home alive, whether those executives appreciate it or not. Somewhere below, Manhattan rushed forward through another ordinary workday beneath steel towers and crowded avenues while helicopters crossed carefully through the pale February sky above the river. I stopped near the rooftop railing overlooking the skyline where winter sunlight reflected endlessly across glass buildings stretching toward downtown. Then I smiled quietly to myself because Garrett Sloan spent years believing helicopters represented status, speed, and power. But real aviation authority never belonged to the billionaire demanding departure. It belonged to the quiet people willing to stop the flight when everyone else was too afraid to say no.